The UN Climate Summit, COP28, opened in Dubai with loud calls for binding commitments on ending the use of fossil fuels. The Secretary General of the United Nations, Antonio Guterres, said he wanted to see countries agree to the phasing out of fossil fuels within a reasonable timeframe. Guterres went on to say that the resources are available, but that there is a lack of political will. Now, Africa is responsible for less than 5% of global emissions, but African countries are among the worst affected by a warming planet. And Zambia is currently chairing the African Group of Negotiators, which will be representing the interests of the continent at this year's summit. And we can now talk to our reporter, Blaise Iyong, who is at the COP28 summit in Dubai. Blaise, I want to start on the use of fossil fuels. There are loud calls to phase out the use of fossil fuels. What is Africa's position on this one?
Well, a lot of African delegates that we have spoken to here in Dubai believe that Africa would eventually have to move to fossil fuels, but at the moment that's not feasible. I was speaking to someone from the Namibian delegation. As you may recall, Namibia discovered oil not so long ago, and she was telling me that this, as she called, is blessing given to Africa, and she thinks that Africa would continue to exploit fossil fuel for the moment to be able to build industries, build capacity, get enough money that would enable Africa now to move to renewable energy. So at the moment, Africa's position, as far as the delegates that we've spoken to is concerned, is that Africa would continue to kind of get involved in fossil fuel. For example, Nigeria depends on fossil fuel a lot. 80% of Nigerians' revenue comes from petrol.
Stand by, Blaise, because I want for us to get a picture of how urgent the climate change situation is for millions of people in Africa whose lives have really been upended by the phenomenon.
Fleeing the rising waters. Heavy rainfall in Somalia has ended decades of drought, but it's brought little relief.
We climbed trees. The whole night until morning we were beating jerry cans as a means to call for help. We put babies and the elderly in beds and on trees and slopes. These floods have been going on for 2 weeks.
Because the land is hard and dry and can't absorb the water, there's been massive flooding. Families were already struggling after 5 consecutive seasons of lower than average rainfall. Scientists say the last 2 years of drought in the Horn of Africa were made at least 100 times more likely and much stronger due to global warming. The World Bank estimates that more than 9.5 million livestock across the Horn of Africa have died. Hundreds of thousands of people in Somalia were driven from their homes into makeshift camps like this one near the town of Badoa to escape the dry conditions. Experts say it's people like these who have done the least to contribute to climate change that are facing the brunt of the impacts.
We are in the world now where developed countries, the same countries that are saying that they want meaningful mitigation action by us, are continuing applying double standards. Loss and damages that we are facing is because of their emission.
Loss and damage continues to be a big topic at the climate conference in Dubai. Last year, industrialized nations agreed to develop a fund to help poorer nations deal with the effects of global warming. Extreme weather events like flooding and drought, and so-called slow onset impacts like sea level rise. Negotiators have agreed that the World Bank will manage the fund initially, but they've yet to decide how much money should go into the pot and which countries should get it. Critics say that whatever is promised is unlikely to be enough.
Developing countries have put forth a proposal where they're saying we need at least $100 billion per year by 2030. And that is not being acceptable to rich countries. But unfortunately, that's the reality. And I must emphasize the scale of impacts have increased because of the inactions in the past.
While discussions over financing continue, communities in Somalia are facing the realities of a warming planet. Despite initial pledges, it could still be some time before they see any compensation for what they've lost.
Blaise, tell us about the agreement that's been reached at COP28 to help poorer nations like Somalia cope with the impact of climate change.
Christine, so we have to go back to last year in Sharm el-Sheikh in Egypt, COP27. There was this agreement that these loss and damage fund will be set up, and this year, finally delegates have agreed on how that would be. We understand that it will be under the auspices of the World Bank, and money will be put there by developing and industrial countries, and also countries like Gulf countries like the UAE, and countries that are also involved in fossil fuel exploration. And this money would then move to countries like Somalia, countries like Libya, countries that are affected by drought, are affected by extreme weather, conflict, countries also that are affected by rise in sea level and sea coming into cities and communities.
Blaise, a big part of the climate change conversation is everybody having a voice. And I want to get a sense from you, from what you're hearing from the African representatives at the summit. Do they feel that Africa's voice is being heard in this conversation, given that this is the continent that is worst affected by climate change?
Well, I think it's not just if Africa's voice is being heard, it's if Africa's voice is being heard on time. For example, we've just spoken about the loss and damage fund that has been set up here that has been agreed upon here in Dubai, but this has been 30 plus years coming, conversations after conversations. And so for a lot of the African delegates, it's not as though their voice are not being heard. It's sometimes their voice are not heard on time, or actually there's a lot of talk without action. But for some of the African delegates that we've spoken to, they have insisted that they would continue pushing, they would continue making their position clear and known to the rest of the world. Like you rightly pointed out, Africa is the worst affected continent when it comes to the effects of climate change, and Africa contributes less than 5% of global emission.
All right, that is our reporter Blaise Ayer at the COP28 summit for us. Thank you, Blaise. We appreciate your reporting. At COP28, countries will also be trying to iron out the details of how to establish the international trade of carbon credits. Carbon credits are a financial instrument used to reduce an entity's carbon emissions. Now, several countries, including South Africa and Kenya, are betting on this to boost revenues. Now, here's a quick explanation of how this system works. A government or a company struggling to reduce its emissions and meet climate targets can compensate by funding a climate-friendly project elsewhere. For example, a factory in Europe can fund a tree planting initiative in an African country. My next guest is here to talk more about carbon credits with us. Stanley Kimarin Oleriamit is an Indigenous peoples leader from the Maasai community in Kenya. Welcome to DW News Africa, Stanley. So, carbon credits, they sound like a win-win for everybody, sort of like a real concrete way to have big emitters pay for their pollution and that money going into environmentally friendly projects. Now, is it as straightforward as that?
It may sound straightforward, but the reality is quite to the contrary. There are basically two carbon markets in the world. One is a so-called compliance regulatory market imposed by the state based on national law and the UNFCCC guidance, and another one based on voluntary carbon, which is basically industry actors who are concerned about their reputation as emitters and want to be politically correct by showing this certificate of offsets. They are aspiring to what they call net zero. As opposed to zero emissions, they just want a balance equation. I emit 10 metric tons of carbon, I have a certificate elsewhere for 10 metric tons of carbon. And most projects in Kenya are those under the voluntary carbon market, with very little regulation based on market actors, both the developers of projects, the verifiers of emission reduction. All these are market actors interested in profit. And these communities are unaware of what is, very little information of what they are signing up for. They are told this is free money for air, but is it really free? Of course, the conditionalities for how you graze, for what you harvest, they do herbal medicine communities. They use twigs for fencing sometimes, branches and so on. And all these are now seen as carbon. And forests are not just about carbon. They are about spirituality. They are about health. They are about honey. So all these visions of nature are in conflict. But what is on the table is just the abstraction of this abstract property called carbon. And communities have very little information. So they don't engage from a point of information. It is not a mutually respectful, equitable arrangement. There is a power differentiation based on knowledge of the product, knowledge of the market, knowledge of the system, and access to markets which communities are unaware.
Stanley, from that perspective then, if tweaks could be made to the carbon markets, like, for example, in the conversation that's going to be had at COP28, if some of these concerns could be addressed and perhaps these things could be fixed, would there potentially be an opportunity to have a real win-win situation then with the carbon credits?
Well, I think I totally ascribe to the reality that climate is in a crisis, and we need to think about a solution as humanity, and that carbon, dioxide is one of the greenhouse gases according to science, and we need to do something. But I think we must focus at the primary sources of these carbon emissions. We need to think about, because the challenge of carbon emission reduction in territorial carbon, for example, is we have to come to this general behavior as humanity that identifies and connects for this to be permanent. And I don't see humanity coming to that one position across nation states, across people groups, that this forest will stay. I could stay hungry and let the tree stand because I want to save the planet.
Carbon credit markets are going to be on the agenda at COP28. What would you then be advocating for in this regard?
I would advocate for those who are highly polluting, those who have historically contributed to the problem, to change how they do development, to shift from high carbon intensive production system based on fossil fuel, including, for example, the host country here in Dubai, which is the United Arab Emirates hosting the COP28, shift to renewable energy, shift to wind, shift to solar and hydro, which are relatively more renewable and less carbon intensive. But by choosing not to shift from the main source of carbon, we are just, postponing the solution and going closer to that disaster and crisis that we want to avoid. So I would say, the way to reduce the livelihood chances of communities by minimizing the right and the utilization of their land and offsetting is transferring the burden of pollution to communities who have the least carbon footprints and letting off the hook those with the highest responsibility for pollution.
Right. That is Stanley Kimarin Oleriamit. Thank you so much for sharing your insights with us here on DW News Africa.
Thank you very much for having me.
In Kenya, some innovators are working on climate-related projects to make a difference, even as raising capital remains a challenge. DW's Edith Kimani reports from Nairobi. When Eric Bosire co-founded IRI, his goal was to make farmers rich. He and his team produce irrigation and water harvesting systems, and they're working to integrate artificial intelligence, mobile networks, and sensors to enable ultra-precision, ultra-efficient farming. But getting the financing they needed was no walk in the park.
Specifically as an African startup trying to develop something innovative, it's really tough. And I think for us, it was just that resilience. You know, we kept working with the few resources that we had. And I think all the profits that we make as a company, we always injected back to the business. So with the few resources that we had, that's what we kept using and kept going.
In its first years of operation, Bosire's company secured support from the African Development Bank and the World Bank. Their financing was crucial to getting products to market. And to farmers like Robert Wasukira. His strawberry farm runs with a simple drip irrigation system powered by solar energy. He got the system from Bosire's company for a one-time cost of around $450.
I feel so happy because I'm making a profit. You see, my children are going to school. I'm eating well. Don't you think I look healthy? One of my children is now in university because of this farming.
Chebet Lesan turns farm waste into fuel. Initially, she relied on friends for financial support. Her company, Bright Green, is now well established, producing renewable briquettes to replace charcoal and firewood.
Where businesses win is when you start to get money from the customer, because that means that you've produced enough value for somebody to say, I have 1,000 shillings, I could buy airtime, I could buy food, or I could buy your product. And they choose your product because your product offers the most value. I think that's what we should start celebrating in investors, as opposed to celebrating how much money you have raised. Because we've seen money that has been raised that really hasn't produced customers, paying customers.
Lesan has been working on this since 2016, so has built up enough business momentum that she now finds it easier to secure financing. This means she can work with investors who also prioritize climate impact over profit. Vincent Kiarie founded Motor Hope Capital, a social enterprise to fund small, local, and green businesses. He would like to see more African investors funding climate projects on the continent.
If you have players financing entrepreneurs in Africa, then it means they understand the environment and they come up with sort of, a product that, fits, this market. Because the other thing that we have with the international funders is the mismatch. They don't understand the market. So if you have a local solution, I think that would be, a good thing for the entrepreneurs.
Bosire got his company up and running with funding from regional and global sources. He'd like to see more local options for the next generation of climate innovators.